the Columbia University Center for Undergraduate Global Engagement, in partnership with Columbia Global Centers and Columbia World Projects, launched this initiative in May 2020 as a virtual exchange initiative to support students around the world. The Collaboratory brings students, thought leaders, and educators together. It promotes cross-cultural communication and enhances skills and global competence to allow students to reflect, ideate, and collaborate to empower them to make a difference in the world. And we have Collaboratory students tuning in today from China, India, Ireland, Israel, Tunisia, and the USA, just to name a few.
Plastic pollution is one of the biggest, most urgent challenges faced by humanity. According to estimates by the United Nations Environmental Programme, global plastic production will surpass 1,000 million tons by 2050. Single-use plastic, which constitutes more than 50% of global production, used primarily for packaging and delivery, is the most difficult to recycle. Less than 10% has ever been recycled. Most of the plastic is washed into streams, rivers, oceans, or ends up in landfills. Not only does plastic take around 400 years to decompose, it also leaves a massive carbon footprint with around 4% global emissions, according to OECD figures. Focusing on this urgent global challenge, Columbia Global Centers Mumbai is organizing interactive seminars with the Columbia Global Collaboratory to bring in eminent scientists, policymakers, and innovators to provide a holistic view of plastic pollution. We warmly welcome our three panelists, Dr. Bejan Yan, Dr. Alexandra Harrington, Ms. Shalini Goyal Bhalla.
Plastic was invented in 1907, the first one, and then in the next 50 years, they are invented more than 10 of these plastics, different type of plastics, and you can see they have a very different molecular structures. And because of these different molecular structures, so they have very different physical and chemical characteristics, which means that plastic is being produced has a very high versatility. Also, they are very durable, and also they can be very inexpensive. But part of the reason is because the raw material was made directly from the petroleum. So because of all these physical chemical characteristics, so the industry really loved it, and so they are used in almost everything in our life. Between 1950 to 2015, the primary productions of the plastic was 8.3 billion metric tons. And 1/3 was still in use, and only pathetically, we only have 10% being recycled, and most of them was discarded to the environments, to the landfills, or getting into the waterways, and then getting into our oceans, okay? So those plastics, when they are getting into the environment, so they are under the physical, chemical, and biological breaking down, weathering processes, and they become smaller and smaller. Then eventually they reach to the microplastic and also nanoscales. So in order to really look into whether they are in the, how they are, what kind of distribution of that. So I did some work in my home. This is my, the washing machine in my home, and I collected the water, filtered wastewater from the washers, and then I used SEM, scanning electron microscope, and to try to figure out what is actually there. And you can clearly see there was a lot of these fibers. Also, we also find they are not only have fiber, but also have these microplastics and also nanoplastics. And so we actually see much more of these nanoscales particles than the micro plastics. So clearly, this is the first time in the world actually demonstrating that nanoplastics emission coming out from the laundry wastewater. Is the particle size. It really matters. Because when the particle size is small enough, they can cross the epithelial cells and then get into blood streams, and then they can transport to the vital organs. Just doing the environmental science and also environmental health was not be able to handle this. We need some experts from the other field. For example, environmental law, wastewater treatment plants, and also waste management, etc. So with that, I actually formed this Columbia Plastic Pollution Analysis and Sustainable Solution Working Group.
In early or mid to early 2022, there was a call for the UN Environment Assembly to authorize the beginning phases of negotiations for a treaty, an international treaty on plastic pollution. And some of you, if you've heard of this, you may have heard phrasing such as to ban plastics, etc. That is not actually the intended scope. The intended scope is to address plastic pollution as an international issue, as a global level threat on many different fronts, and find ways to move forward. So once that authorization was given by the UN Environment Assembly, the UNEP, UN Environment Program, then began the process of determining when we may have our first negotiation sessions and what those negotiation sessions would look like. So the goal is to have a treaty that is agreed upon by as many states as possible that will then go to the UN Environment Assembly for review, hopefully endorsement, and be open to states that want to sign on and ratify at home. Is the idea of what is plastics? When we say plastic, something is plastic, how do we define that? What are microplastics? What are macroplastics? What are biodegradable plastics? So in something that is as complex as a plastics treaty, there is a very fundamental issue of how we provide definitions. Or do we provide definitions, or do we link them to evolving standards over time? This is something that we are still discussing, but really will be quite critical to address. The interactions between these types of existing entities, so the UNFCCC, the Convention on Biological Diversity, there are a great deal of them, and how they converge on the issue of plastics, so that when we create a treaty that allows us to move forward and regulate plastics at the global scale, but not ask states that are often either least developed states or developing states or small island developing states to replicate and duplicate their activities under other treaty regimes, which is costly, it's inefficient, and it tends to put a great strain on ministries that are already under strain and stress, and can be actually quite counterproductive. Our plastic pollution issue comes from the maritime context, and especially has a very particular impact, a very particular negative impact on small island developing states and states with large maritime coastlines. So one of the really critical element to address as we think about what the Plastics Treaty has in its terms is how we will be merging the general interest in regulating plastic pollution with the specific needs of those states that are most affected by it, and often are in politically somewhat weaker positions in negotiations. Other issues that we do have coming up on our radar, and that certainly were raised during the negotiations as things that we do need to address, include things such as circularity and the idea of life cycle regulations for plastic products and for the plastic industry. The idea of just transitions, and I mention this because it actually came up. It's something that many people, such as myself, have advocated for a long time. But this came up in the context of not only making sure that transitions in the labor force, in, say, the plastics production side, are just, but especially in the context of often marginalized groups, such as waste pickers, and especially women. The waste pickers groups were actually quite active and quite vocal in the plastics treaty negotiation, at least the first plastics treaty negotiation, and really did bring this out to the point where several states have actually now formed a coalition around this idea of just transitions in plastic pollution. So it's something that tends to be, I think, overlooked a great deal, but really is quite critical to how we frame this treaty. Indigenous communities have a special role in this, especially for states that are the small island states, and especially in the South Pacific, where we see a great deal of nexus between often very threatened indigenous communities and threatened territory because of plastic pollution.
It's very, very important to understand who are the stakeholders in the plastic industry in the ball game together. The very first is the waste generator. Then these are the waste which is generated within the cities, within the areas, is managed by the local bodies. And last but not least are the PIBOs, the producers, importers, and the brand owners who are responsible for the plastic manufacturing. So I speak about the Indian government, who has a rule, a policy in EPR, Extended Producers Responsibility, where all these three stakeholders have been kind of put into under the law or the regulation to manage the plastic waste that they are producing. The Extended Producers Responsibility was a very kind of a intelligent step to manage and involve people at large to manage the plastic waste. But the policy focuses towards the end of life waste management. And when we talk about circularity, we do manage the products at the end of their life cycle, but how to reduce the waste in first place, as the circularity's very first principle is to design out waste. What is being done towards that? I think that is one focus we talk about. We need to understand how are the economies working today. What are the kind of models that we see? Right now, what we are seeing is that the producers are producing and putting the material on the shelves, and which is consumed by the consumers, ultimately landing up in the waste, mostly the landfills, which is sometimes, in case of India, specifically in case of plastics, segregated to a very large scale and recycled. But how much percentage is being recycled vis-a-vis how much is being produced, we know that it's minuscule at this stage. So how do we still kind of take care of our problem? And the problem that we have been discussing is plastic waste and its management. So what is required? A complete reshift in the thinking is required. A rethinking where we use this versatile material in such a way that despite criticizing it, we need to find out ways to, one, managing it at the end of life. Two is to reduce the waste or design out the waste from the cycles altogether.
Well, we've had an engaging discussion on the impacts of plastic pollution. Our conversation touched on many critical issues, including the elimination of problematic plastic packaging and single-use plastic, circular business models, policy, justice, fairness, and citizen action, and how to address the problem from plastic pollution using green solutions, innovation, and technology. This was the first seminar in a series of seminars focused on plastics, retelling the story of waste, delivered as part of the Global Columbia Collaboratory, a virtual exchange platform that's bringing Columbia students, thought leaders, and educators from around the globe together to reflect, ideate, and collaborate to make an impact.